December 1943, Ortona, Italy. The Germans called it the Little Stalingrad, a coastal town on the Adriatic, all narrow medieval streets and stone buildings 3 floors thick, stairwells that became kill zones and doorways that became graves. The Wehrmacht had turned every block into a fortress. Every corner was a decision that could end a man permanently. The standard telling of Ortona focuses on the infantry, the street fighting, the mouse-holing, Canadian soldiers blasting holes through shared walls to avoid the streets entirely, moving through buildings like ghosts through stone. That story is real and it is brutal and it deserves to be told. But it is not the whole story. The whole story involves 14 rifles, 14 men positioned across the Ortona sector in the winter of 1943 who did something that German battalion commanders found so operationally damaging that they referenced a single Canadian firing position in 7 separate official communications over a 72-hour period. 7 reports. 1 position. 72 hours. The records show what those 14 men cost the Wehrmacht in the Ortona sector. Not in bodies. In something the Wehrmacht valued more than bodies and could replace less easily. They cost it the ability to function. The Seaforth Highlanders of Canada and the loyal Edmonton Regiment had been fighting through the Italian campaign since the Allied landings in Sicily in July 1943. 5 months of combat up the spine of the peninsula, through terrain that seemed specifically designed to give defending infantry every possible advantage. Mountains, river crossings, winter mud that immobilized vehicles and turned every advance into a foot march against prepared positions. By the time they reached Ortona in December 1943, these were not rookie soldiers. They were men who had learned the particular curriculum that combat teaches, where the lessons are written in the bodies of friends and the price of inattention is immediate and permanent. They had developed instincts that no training program produces because no training program can replicate the specific education of months of actual killing. Among those instincts was something that Canadian snipers in the Italian campaign had refined to a level that German intelligence found genuinely difficult to explain. Patience. Absolute, geological patience. A German sniper operated on a different philosophy. Identify a target, acquire it, eliminate it. Relocate. The cycle was efficient and it worked against opponents who expected it. But Canadian snipers in the Italian campaign had studied the German sniper pattern long enough to understand its rhythm. And once you understand a rhythm, you can set a trap inside it. A Canadian sniper would select a position not for the shot it offered today, but for the shot it would offer in 48 hours, once the Germans had concluded the position was inactive. He would establish the position, fire once, sometimes not at all, and go completely cold. No movement, no activity, nothing for a day, sometimes 2. The Germans would observe the position, log it as cleared or abandoned, and resume normal operations in its line of sight. Then the Canadian would take his shot. This is documented in German after-action reports from the Italian campaign. And the frustration in the language of those reports is not something professional military officers allow into official documents, unless the situation is genuinely exceptional. One regimental commander noted that his unit had cleared a specific building twice, confirmed it empty twice, and been taken under accurate fire from it twice more. He requested clarification from higher command on how to address an opponent who appeared to treat confirmed clearances as temporary inconveniences. There was no clarification available, because the answer was not a tactical procedure. The answer was that the Canadians had simply decided that the rules about how long you stay in a position, how often you fire, and when you move were suggestions rather than requirements, and that the only real rule was the one that kept you alive long enough to take the next shot. In the Ortona sector specifically, a small group of snipers from the Seaforth Highlanders took up positions on and around the Via Ortona, the main road running through the town, in mid-December 1943. The German defensive plan for Ortona relied on that road as a reinforcement and resupply corridor. Troops moved along it after dark. Ammunition came up on it. Casualties went back on it. It was the circulatory system of the German defense, and the Canadians had positioned themselves to watch it. What followed over the next several weeks is reconstructed from both Canadian regimental war diaries and German unit records captured at the end of the Italian campaign. German company commanders stopped moving in daylight along any route with a line of sight to the Via Ortona sector. Resupply patterns were altered to avoid a 200-meter stretch of open ground that had cost the same unit 3 casualties in 4 days. A German battalion commander issued a standing instruction that no officer above the rank of lieutenant was to be visible from the upper stories of any building along a specific grid reference, because something behind those windows was specifically selecting officers and doing it with a consistency that indicated deliberate targeting rather than opportunistic fire. That last point is critical. The records show that German officer casualties in the Ortona sector during December 1943 and January 1944 were disproportionately high relative to enlisted casualties in the same engagements. This was not accident. Canadian snipers in the Italian campaign had adopted the standard Allied doctrine of priority targeting: remove the commanders first, because a platoon without its lieutenant becomes 30 individuals instead of a single coordinated unit. The Germans understood this doctrine. They had practiced versions of it themselves. What they could not adjust to was the precision with which it was being applied. An officer who exposes himself briefly in a doorway for 3 seconds during a movement between buildings at dusk should not be a viable target. The geometry is wrong. The light is wrong. The time window is too small. The Canadian snipers at Ortona had been watching that doorway for 6 hours. The effect on German command function in the Ortona sector was documented with unusual frankness in the post-engagement reports. Units that still had weapons, ammunition, and men in position reported reduced operational effectiveness because junior officers were reluctant to expose themselves to communicate between positions. Platoon-level coordination degraded. Response times to Canadian infantry movements slowed. And in several documented instances, German counterattacks that should have been launched within minutes of a Canadian penetration were delayed because the officer responsible for ordering the counterattack could not safely reach the position from which the counterattack needed to be observed and directed. 14 rifles did this. 14 men watching from windows and rubble piles and positions that had been cold so long the Germans had stopped watching them. They did not win the Battle of Ortona by themselves. The infantry won Ortona, street by street, building by building, through 3 weeks of the most brutal close-quarters fighting Canadians had experienced since the Great War. But the infantry won it faster and at lower cost, because 14 men had spent those same 3 weeks systematically dismantling the German command layer. Every officer who could not safely move was an officer who could not effectively command. Every resupply route that was watched was a route the Germans had to abandon or pay for in blood. Every position the Germans thought was cleared that opened up again was another erosion of the certainty that an army needs to function. Ortona fell on December 28, 1943. The after-action assessments filed by Canadian commanders noted the effectiveness of sniper operations in general terms, with appropriate military brevity. The assessments filed by German commanders who had been on the other side of those rifles were considerably less brief. The word used in multiple reports, translated from the German, is not a military term. It is a psychological one. Demoralizing. Not the weapons, not the numbers, not the artillery or the tank support or the tactical coordination of the infantry assaults. The thing that the German reports identified as having most significantly degraded their defensive effectiveness in the Ortona sector was the sustained psychological pressure of operating under observation by an enemy they could not locate, predict, or neutralize. You cannot fight what you cannot find. And for 3 weeks in December 1943 and January 1944, the German garrison at Ortona could not find 14 Canadians who had decided that patience was a weapon, that silence was a position, and that the most dangerous thing in a battle is not the man shooting at you. It is the man you do not know is there. The snipers came home after the war. Some went back to farms and logging camps and the kind of physical work that had built the patience and the stillness that made them so effective in the first place. Some never spoke about it. Some left accounts in regimental archives that sat unread for decades, written in the flat, factual prose of men who had done something extraordinary and saw no particular reason to dress it up. The German reports that documented what those 14 rifles cost the Wehrmacht are in the Italian campaign records, cross-referenced by historians who noticed the pattern of officer casualties and started pulling on the thread. The thread led back to a handful of windows on the Via Ortona, to positions that had been cold for 2 days before the shot came, to men who had learned that in war, as in the Canadian wilderness that produced them, the most important thing you can do is wait and watch and make every shot count.